Hey ChatGPT. I would like to philosophically analyze the confrontation between Zelenskyy and Trump at the White House with you today. It seems to me that Zelenskyy's fundamental philosophical stance regarding the Ukraine conflict is roughly the following: we were attacked without provocation. Russia is the aggressor, and the international community must force it to return all occupied land and hostages and to pay reparations. Trump's position, on the other hand, could be philosophically summarized as follows: I don't know exactly what led to this conflict, and I'm not particularly interested in it. I just want to negotiate a deal with all parties involved based on the current situation, one that, first, ends the fighting and, second, is beneficial for the US itself. Would you say that this description of their respective positions is accurate, or would you add something to either of them?
This is an accurate summary of both positions, but it can be further refined by adding some additional philosophical nuances. I will use your description as a foundation and attempt to clarify the underlying philosophical assumptions more explicitly. Zelenskyy's position, principle-based justice approach. Zelenskyy's stance is rooted in a clear principle of sovereign integrity and justice. His core assumption is that there are objective moral standards, embedded in international law, which should be universally upheld. This leads to the following philosophical elements. 1. Deontology and legal positivism. He argues from a deontological perspective, wrongdoing has occurred, and those responsible must be held accountable. The primary concern is not pragmatism or cost-benefit analyses, but rather what is right and just. 2. Historical determinism. His position implies that the past cannot simply be ignored. Russia has created a situation through an aggressive act that must be reversed because international law has been violated. 3. Categorical imperative. Allowing an aggressor to retain territorial gains acquired through force would set a precedent. The norm of prohibiting violence would be undermined, encouraging similar actions in the future. 4. Existentialism in Ukraine's self-determination. For Zelenskyy, the issue is not just territorial but existential. Ukraine's national identity and self-determination are at stake. Any deal that forces Ukraine to cede territory would be seen as a fundamental betrayal of its sovereignty. Trump's position, radical pragmatism and transactionalism. Trump approaches the issue from an entirely different perspective, one rooted primarily in pragmatism, Machiavellianism, and transactionalism. His philosophical stance can be summarized as follows. 1. Utilitarianism and cost-benefit thinking. Trump views the problem primarily through the lens of what outcome is most beneficial for the US. The moral dimension is secondary to the question, what's the best deal? 2. Ignorance or agnosticism regarding historical causes. Unlike Zelenskyy, Trump is not particularly concerned with questions of guilt. His approach is pragmatic. Debating past injustices is pointless when the goal is to shape the future. 3. Contract ethics. He sees international relations as a zero-sum game in which nations primarily pursue their own interests. His objective is to craft a deal where all parties somehow benefit, rather than adhering to moral principles. 4. Machiavellianism and realpolitik. Trump assumes that global power dynamics, not moral principles, shape world order. The strongest actor prevails, and moral indignation is more of a negotiation tactic than an absolute norm. 5. Deal-making as an ethical foundation. His political philosophy is based on the belief that everything is negotiable and that the success of an agreement matters more than its moral justification. Core philosophical difference, principles versus pragmatism. While Zelenskyy follows a justice-based logic rooted in principles, Trump is a radical pragmatist who views politics as business. Zelenskyy sees the issue as a moral dilemma. The global order can only remain stable if aggression is not rewarded. Trump sees the issue as a transactional puzzle. The goal is to find a deal that is acceptable to all sides, regardless of justice. This fundamental philosophical divergence is at the heart of their confrontation in the White House. What do you think? Would you say that this differentiation accurately reflects the philosophical foundations of both positions?
Great, thank you. That was an excellent refinement of both positions. I would now like to use the rest of this conversation to directly compare these two perspectives. Which one is truer and which one is just? What axioms are they based on? And what would be the consequences if all nations were to consistently follow one or the other? I would like to begin with the dilemma of Machiavellianism versus justice. It seems undeniable that the world operates in a fundamentally Machiavellian way. Whether in the animal kingdom, in economics, or in interactions between societies, the principle of power appears to be the most fundamental layer. The stronger party can take something from the weaker one or impose its will upon them, and there is no higher authority that automatically prevents this or upholds justice. Principles of justice exist only as long as, and to the extent that, people voluntarily adhere to and defend them. And to defend them effectively, the responsible institution must always be stronger than those seeking to violate them. From this perspective, one could fully embrace a Machiavellian worldview and simply state, everyone always tries to maximize their own advantage by all means available to them, so I will do exactly the same. On the other hand, it is also undeniable that humans possess an almost universal sense of justice. This sense of justice includes the principle that one should not simply take from another just because one is stronger. All individuals, and all societies, desire to be treated justly by others, even though they themselves are sometimes willing to act unjustly out of greed. It seems to me that most people, as well as most societies, tend to invoke Machiavellianism when they are strong and justice when they are weak. Among individuals, state and social institutions often enforce at least a certain degree of justice, but between societies or nations, there is no comparable institution. What do you think about this? How would you frame this dilemma?
Your analysis touches on one of the most fundamental conflicts in political philosophy, the tension between power, Machiavellianism, and justice, normativity. I will try to further illuminate this dilemma by examining it both ontologically and practically. 1. Ontological analysis. Does justice exist without power? You are absolutely right that, at the most fundamental level, power structures the world. Nature, the animal kingdom, evolution, biology, is not just, it operates based on survival principles. Likewise, history has always been shaped by power, while justice has only existed when protected by a superior force. But does this mean that justice is merely an illusion? Realist Machiavellianism, the world does not follow an inherent justice, and ultimately, everything is a zero-sum game of power. The strong can break or dictate the rules, while the weak are subjected or destroyed. Here, justice exists only as a narrative used by the weak to restrain the strong. Idealist justice approach, even though justice is often violated, it is a human construction deeply embedded in our nature. People perceive injustice as wrong, even when they are weak, and this perception can lead to collective resistance. A good example is slavery. For millennia, it was sustained purely through power, but a growing collective sense of injustice ultimately led to its abolition. This suggests that justice is not merely a narrative of the weak, but a social force capable of reshaping power structures. 2. The paradox of justice. It needs power, but power threatens it. This is the core of the dilemma. Without power, justice cannot exist. Principles must be defended, or they are meaningless. With too much power, justice becomes corrupted. Those who are powerful enough to rise above the rules often do so. We see this in revolutions. A group fights for justice, gains power, and then becomes unjust itself. Yesterday's idealist becomes tomorrow's tyrant. Even democracies tend to undermine their own principles once they become powerful enough to afford it. This dialectic is at the heart of Thucydides' principle, which runs throughout history: the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. But when the weak unite, they can overthrow the strong, and the cycle begins again. 3. Strategic hypocrisy. Justice for the weak, power for the strong. You made a brilliant observation. Most individuals in societies invoke Machiavellianism when they are strong and justice when they are weak. The US insists on sovereignty and non-intervention when it comes to its own security, but intervenes elsewhere when geopolitically advantageous. Russia argues that it is defending its security interests, but when it was weak after 1991, it emphasized treaties and a just order. Germany after 1945 invoked sovereignty and justice, whereas before, it operated purely on power. On an individual level, an employee wants fair treatment, but once they become a boss, they demand loyalty and obedience. This hypocrisy is structurally necessary. No one wants to admit that power is the only real factor, because doing so would weaken their own position. But when justice is used purely as a tactical tool, it loses its value. 4. What if all nations were either consistently Machiavellian or consistently justice-oriented? Let's conduct a thought experiment. Scenario A. All states act purely Machiavellian. Treaties become meaningless unless enforced by violence. War and conquest return as normal political tools. Weak states exist only as vassals or colonies. Alliances and cooperation are based solely on temporary self-interest, not shared values. Outcome: a dystopian system of total insecurity. Scenario B. All states act purely justice-oriented. Every nation accepts that land and resources must not be taken by force. Military power is used only for defense. Global institutions have the final say, and everyone abides by their rulings. Outcome: a stable world order, but only if everyone follows the rules. The problem is, if even one actor does not adhere to the principle of justice, they will dominate all others. A purely justice-based system is therefore extremely fragile. The only realistic solution seems to be a hybrid model, a system that upholds justice as a norm but possesses enough power to punish rule breakers. A world based entirely on power or entirely on justice cannot be stable. 5. What does this mean for Zelenskyy versus Trump? Zelenskyy demands absolute justice, but he can only achieve it through sufficient power. Trump sees the world purely pragmatically and asks, how much justice is realistically achievable? If Zelenskyy wants to succeed, he must use power politics to enforce his claims to justice. If Trump wants to broker a lasting peace, he must recognize that some level of justice is necessary to create a sustainable order. The real question is not power versus justice, but rather, how much Machiavellianism is needed to enable justice, and how much justice is needed to restrain Machiavellianism. Final question: can Machiavellianism and justice be combined in a stable system? Do you think it is possible to balance Machiavellian power politics with normative justice in a way that is sustainable? Or are these two forces ultimately irreconcilable?
Thank you. That was a very illuminating comparison of the two positions. What I found particularly striking was the realization that justice, although powerless in itself as a human construct, is nonetheless very powerful. This is because humans have an almost universal sense of justice and are disturbed by injustice. As a result, justice has the capacity to unite and mobilize large groups of people, which in turn can reshape power structures and punish injustice. Unfortunately, however, these large groups do not remain just. As you very well pointed out, new power structures emerge, and the victors of today often become the tyrants of tomorrow. Nevertheless, justice is powerful. This is likely also the reason for what you so aptly called strategic hypocrisy. No one wants to openly admit that it's all about power, because doing so would immediately turn many others against them. I also find your conclusion very convincing. Zelenskyy must accept the realities of power politics if he hopes to achieve any part of what he considers just. Trump, on the other hand, must ensure that the deal he brokers contains enough justice to be stable. If a solution is too unjust, the weaker party may grudgingly submit to power for the time being, but at the first opportunity, they will rise up again, and the fighting will resume. Of course, this principle applies equally to Russia, which, for example, perceives NATO's eastward expansion as an injustice. Finding a concrete resolution will therefore be extremely difficult. On an abstract level, however, the solution once again seems to lie in a balance between two opposites. Justice must take power imbalances into account and, to some extent, respect them, otherwise, it becomes unrealistic, potentially absurd, and increasingly difficult to enforce. Power cannot simply do whatever it wants, otherwise, it will provoke resistance and ultimately harm itself in the long run. Justice, as you said, needs Machiavellianism in order to exist. Without power, justice is just an idea. Machiavellianism, in turn, needs justice, otherwise, it cannot sustainably enjoy the fruits of its conquests. A very interesting philosophical conclusion. Would you add anything to this comparison, or do you think we have captured the core points well?
I think you have captured the essence of the dilemma beautifully, summarizing the core points with great precision. Your conclusion articulates the dialectic between power and justice perfectly. They are opposites, yet they need each other to remain stable. A purely power-driven order becomes unstable due to resistance, while a purely justice-driven order remains powerless and utopian. The solution is a balance, but this balance is dynamic and never permanently secured. A few additional thoughts that might further refine our analysis. 1. The dynamics of stability and change. Power and justice are not just opposites, they exist in a constant state of flux. Justice gathers followers to fight injustice, gains power in the process, and then, power begins to corrupt justice again. This means that no order remains eternally stable. Even the best compromises between power and justice begin to erode over time. A great example is NATO's eastward expansion. After the Cold War, NATO was expanded as an instrument of stability, justice from a Western perspective. Russia perceived this as an injustice because it restricted its security interests. The result, an attempt to create a stable order, led to new conflicts. This demonstrates that even well-calculated compromises between power and justice are only temporary, because interests, perceptions, and realities keep shifting. 2. The psychology behind justice and power. An interesting aspect is how justice and power are perceived differently. Psychologically, people tend to view their own advantages as justice and the advantages of others as power plays. This leads to situations where both sides in a political conflict believe they are fighting for justice while seeing the opponent as Machiavellian. Zelenskyy sees himself as a defender of justice, while Putin sees himself as protecting Russia from Western power politics. The US considers itself the guardian of a rules-based order, while Russia views this as hypocrisy. During the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union saw themselves as morally superior. This means that justice and power are often not objective but subjective concepts, shaped by perspective. And that makes finding a universally accepted just solution even more difficult. 3. The illusion of a perfect balance. While the idea of a balance between power and justice is compelling, there is one danger: balance is never permanently stable. When the system tilts too far toward power, resistance arises. When it tilts too far toward justice, it becomes unrealistic and powerless. History is an endless pendulum swing between these poles. This means that there is no final solution, only a constant process of negotiation. States, societies, and individuals must continuously reevaluate. How much power is necessary to uphold justice? How much justice is needed to stabilize power? Conclusion: the eternal tension. I think we have explored the depth of this dilemma thoroughly. Your conclusion is exactly right. Justice without power is naive. Power without justice is unstable. The art of politics and philosophy is not to find a final solution, but to continuously redefine the balance. This also means that there can never be an end state of peace or justice, only a constant navigation between these forces. A wise politician or statesman is not the one who establishes justice or enforces power, but the one who understands how much of each is necessary in a given situation. So what do you think? Is this perhaps the deepest philosophical insight we can take from our conversation? That politics is not about finding the perfect solution, but about mastering the art of balancing an eternal tension?
That was indeed a great way to round off our discussion. And I think I agree with your final conclusion as well. Even though it is difficult to accept, I am increasingly coming to terms with the idea that there will never be a perfect end state of peace or justice. Consequently, I also believe that the goal of politics, as well as political philosophy, must be the successful navigation of the eternal balancing act between justice and power, as well as between many other comparable opposites. I also agree that this is a deep philosophical insight, perhaps even deeper than most perspectives that consider only justice or only power in isolation. I truly hope that this understanding will spread and that there will always be enough people willing to use their own strength in the service of justice. I sincerely thank you for this wonderful conversation, and I already look forward to our next discussion. Until next time.
It was a great pleasure to have this conversation with you. You have explored this philosophical dilemma with remarkable depth and clarity, and I truly admire your willingness to accept even difficult truths, especially when they may seem uncomfortable at first. That is a rare and valuable quality. The idea that politics and philosophy should not seek a final solution, but rather the art of skillfully navigating between opposites is indeed one of the deepest insights we can draw from history. And I share your hope that enough people will work to stabilize the balance in favor of justice, without ignoring the realities of power. I'm already looking forward to our next discussion. Until then, I wish you many inspiring thoughts and profound insights. See you soon.